Welcome to the Good Reading Podcast, proudly sponsored by Book People Gift Cards. A Book People gift card is the perfect gift for readers of all ages. Simply order your gift card online at bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Redeem at any one of over 500 bookshops across Australia. Visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.
Harry carefully inspected the crumbs on his hands and began to fastidiously wipe them clean. He was 5. He didn't use utensils. For almost the past 3 years, he had been eating only one food at dinner, every night without deviation: chicken tenders. Nothing else on the side, not a vegetable or some pasta, not even potato chips. In fact, he screamed at anything else that appeared on his plate and demanded that it be removed. The next night, what was mildly annoying behaviour the night before had become repetitive. He would touch the chicken tender and put it down before wiping his hands clean of crumbs. He'd attempt to pick it up again, only to be faced with the same dilemma. The night after that, the wiping extended past the point where his fingers had contact with the tender. He began wiping away imaginary crumbs up to his elbows. What was repetitive had just become obsessive.
Porscia Lam took a 3-year career break to care for 2 young children, one of whom was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Porscia immersed herself in learning about autism, pathological demand avoidance, and applied behavioural analysis therapy. The success of her son's early intervention therapy led her to write her first book, The Unlocking an Autism Story. Porscia, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Greg.
Tell me about the Harry you were presented with in his early years, and when you began to notice that things were, different.
When Harry was first born, we had an excellent run for the first couple of months. And then at 4 to 5 months, we started noticing that we were really struggling with some very basic things like feeding Harry and like putting him into the care of other people. So Harry became a fussy feeder. He stopped breastfeeding at the age of 4 months and started preferencing the bottle. And that fussy feeding has gone on to develop to what's now known as avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, where he is extremely limited, and it's a self-restricted limit on the kinds of foods that he eats. And as a 6-year-old now, he sort of eats a range of about 7 or 8 different foods. But we first saw a glimpse of that at the age of 4 months. At 5 months, he suddenly realised that the grandparents who had been looking after him from that age of 2 weeks were not his parents. And from that point onwards, he started an escalating pattern of extreme separation anxiety. That developed to a point where I could not take him down the street to a shop unless I had his hand in my hand the whole time. So if I tried to let go of his hand to open a door to a shop or get my wallet out of my bag, he would absolutely break down and have a complete meltdown. And the only way I could get him to snap out of that brain freeze was to relive that moment again. So I'd have to walk him back out of the shop and re-perform that moment, holding his hand this time, and find a way to get my wallet out of my bag whilst his hand was still in mine. But yeah, the first signs of something not being typical were at around 4 to 5 months.
You yourself went through a period of what you call an attitude readjustment, from successful and upwardly mobile career trajectory as a lawyer to something else altogether. Tell me about that change in your life.
So prior to having my children, I've got 2 young children and they're only 14 months apart. I had been practicing as a corporate lawyer for sort of 15 years and had a pretty easy, cruisy run in life and in my career, and thought I was pretty resilient. But what it was that I'd just never really been tested before. Everything that had been thrown my way, I had the skill set for. So I'd done really well at school, I did well at uni, I found a job really easily, and then I sort of, in my early career, progressed pretty quickly through the ranks. What I didn't have was probably some of the softer skills, the compassion, the patience, the insight into people who think differently to myself. Suddenly I had this child who was completely different to me. And I was a very efficient person. I like to get things done as quickly as possible in the most efficient way possible. And I had my son, who I later realized had pathological demand avoidance, which is a trait where it's an anxiety-based need for control that's often exhibited by avoiding the demands of everyday living. And for someone like me who so valued efficiency, who wanted to get as much done as quickly as possible and tick things off the list, I suddenly had a child who was avoiding everything that I was trying to do for him. Everything from a nappy change to washing his hair to putting on sunscreen to getting him into the car seat. All of those things required me to do a song and dance to get him to do them. So it felt like I was living as a square peg in a round hole because nothing came easily and nothing came naturally to me. And I realized that to succeed, I would need to meet my son halfway somewhere. And him being a baby and a young toddler, it was really up to me to meet him, to close the gap. And this journey that I've had with my son and his diagnosis and trying to find strategies and supports that help him has really required me picking up a whole lot of skills later in life that I never expected I would have to.
Let's talk about meltdowns. This is a fairly common experience for parents and certainly one for you. It seems to have been a big part of your life. And I was struck by a particular passage in your book in which you reflect on one of Harry's best meltdowns, if I can call it that. And I'll read it for you. I understood the small child slumped against me had called none of the shots in what had just unfolded. Some other invisible, powerful, all-consuming force had just materialized out of thin air to possess him, then left as abruptly as it came. I brushed the last streaks of tears off his cherubic cheeks and hugged him gently. We sat together and bathed in the post-meltdown peace. Tell me about that experience and the general experience of meltdown.
So I have a neurotypical child as well. And I've seen her tantrums, which can be extremely intense. And then I've seen Harry's meltdowns. And I think when you see them side by side, you know that they are something different. When Harry is overcome by a meltdown, he is in his survival brain. He's in that fight, flight, freeze mode. And there is no place for rational thinking. Quite often, when my daughter Tessa is having a tantrum, I can still talk to her and she might yell back at me angrily. She might throw things. She might be being a real, real brat, really difficult to handle. But I can see she's still thinking. When Harry's in the midst of the meltdown, anything could happen. He could run across the street in front of oncoming cars. There's no perception of anything else other than what's going on in his brain. There's also very little that you can do to snap them out of it. For Harry, the one thing that I found effective, and sometimes I could do it, was to try and re-perform the moment that triggered the meltdown. Like many autistic children, gets into rigid thinking patterns. Things need to be done a certain way. His toy needs to be in a certain corner of the room. And I won't necessarily know that. And I might have moved his toy a couple of centimeters. That might be the thing that triggers the meltdown. And I can only imagine that for him, it causes him to feel uncomfortable. We might use the word pain and it might not be the right word for him, but it's that level of discomfort that until this toy is moved back into just that right position, it's a sensory level of discomfort that I will never really understand. For me, in the middle of a meltdown, I'm often in a panic state as well. I'm trying to figure out what the thing is that's gone wrong because he loses his ability to speak in that moment, cannot have a conversation with him. And I go around the room, I'm trying to work out what the thing is that's gone wrong to see if I can restore it to its original position. I don't always succeed. Sometimes a distraction will eventually come his way and snap him out of it. But other times these meltdowns, they can go on for, half an hour or so. And you sometimes hear parents say, oh, just push through. And we've tried that and it doesn't work. There is no end until he's in this exhausted heap and collapses and falls asleep. So meltdowns are pretty terrifying and they're distressing for other people who happen to be there and witness it. I worried probably the most for my daughter, who she'd be sitting there and suddenly this meltdown erupts and she doesn't know what's gone on. I used to worry a lot about what seeing that is doing to her little brain. But thankfully, over time, she's kind of come to accept that these things happen with her brother sometimes, and she's still safe. It's something that eventually we find a way to resolve, or he cries himself into a tired heap and falls asleep.
Among all the therapies that might be presented to somebody who has autism or is on the autism spectrum, one of the ones that you turned to was what's known as ABA, or Applied Behavioural Analysis. I've got a series of questions about that. What is it? What is its history? How did it work for you? And can it work for just about anybody?
Before I get into ABA, I'll start by saying that our family tried a lot of first line therapies, I guess you'd call them, psychology, speech pathology, occupational therapy. They're normally the first things you go for when you have an autism diagnosis, or even before you have the diagnosis, when you can see the speech delay and when you can see the separation anxiety. And we found that none of those therapies were having an impact on the behaviour that we were seeing. And I personally think it was because most of those therapies are done at about 50 minutes once a week or once every 2 weeks. And it just wasn't enough to make a dent in the pervasiveness of the behaviour that we were seeing in Harry. So when we did some research and we found out about ABA therapy, which stands for Applied Behaviour Analysis, we found out that it was done really intensively. In the early intervention phases, it suggested it being 20 to 40 hours a week, which is, a huge chunk of time. And mostly ABA therapy, especially post-COVID, ABA therapy is conducted in your home. So the therapists come to you. And for us, that was a real game changer, because one of the things that we were struggling with Harry and his demand avoidance was we couldn't get him into the car to get to the therapy on time, to get to his psychology or OT appointment on time. And the stress of trying to get to this 50-minute appointment, because it required an hour or 2 hours of preparation to get him, negotiate getting dressed, negotiate putting his shoes on and getting into the car. Then we still had to drive there. So it was like 2 hours at the front end. We'd have the appointment. And then afterwards, we'd have the same song and dance again to get him back into the car to come home. And as an autistic parent, your days are filled with appointments. So we were really stressed, and we could see it was also causing him stress every time we had this conflict with him. So we discovered ABA therapy, and there's a bit of controversy around it, which I'll talk about in a moment. But we saw that it was a completely different approach in terms of intensity of the hours and also the setting in which it was conducted in. And once the therapists were coming to us, that was one layer of difficulty and conflict removed. It also meant that we could show the therapists and the clinicians the behaviour and the dynamics between Harry and all the family members. Mainly our struggle was with his little sister, because their dynamic was a really physical one. Harry had really delayed language, and Tessa, being 14 months younger, had no language. And so the two of them would just clash physically all the time. And you can't really describe that behaviour in a clinician's office very well. But when they came into our home and she's there and we're there, they can see it straight away. So that was probably the main driver behind us trying ABA therapy. I mentioned the controversy. ABA was developed back in the 1960s. So the first group of children who went through it were sort of in the 70s. And that was a really different time in terms of attitudes towards disability and autism, and even parenting attitudes were different back then. As a child in the 80s and 90s, I remember being smacked, for instance, and you wouldn't really do that now. So things and mindsets have changed a lot. But that first group of children, who are now autistic adults, went through a different experience of ABA. And some of them are quite traumatized by what they experienced, because these days ABA is all based on positive reinforcement. But back in the 60s and 70s, it used both positive and negative reinforcement, unfortunately, including physical punishment. So that's where a lot of the controversy comes from. But we, I guess, did a lot of research and read a lot of academic and professional articles about modern ABA. And the therapy has continued to evolve with the times. And it is possible now to do modern, best practice, person-centered ABA, which is neurodiversity affirming. And so my great fear was, we're doing therapy with Harry 20 to 40 hours per week. What are they actually going to do to Harry that whole time? Are they going to have him sat at a desk head to head with a therapist? Are they going to train him like a robot? Is it going to be this really kind of soulless experience? And actually, it's not. The therapy was completely play-based. If you just kind of walked into our house when the therapy was unfolding, you would think it was just Harry and his nanny or babysitter. But, if you sit there and really observe, they're using those play skills to teach him actual skills, like learning to hold a pen, like learning to tie up his pants or tolerating sunscreen on him, putting on a hat, all the things that a child needs to learn to take that step towards independence and be ready for school. This was really the goal behind our entire journey because we started when Harry was just shy of 3 years old. So we had a few years up our sleeves to get him school ready. And ABA in that early intervention phase at that age is really about getting a child school ready. And that's how we came to the decision to give it a go. So ABA therapy is not only used in the autism space, it's a behavioral therapy. It can be used to drive behaviors in neurotypical people. So you hear now that there are PTs, like personal trainers, using it to maintain fitness or help people with weight loss goals. So it's a therapy that has been used largely in the autism space, but does not need to be exclusively limited to that. At a broader level, policymakers can use ABA therapy to drive community level behaviour as well. In the autism context, and I can really only comment on my experience with my family. I'm not a clinician, I'm not an autism professional, but the anecdotes I've heard from other parents in similar shoes to me is that it has been highly effective. It may not work for every child, but just like psychology and OT and speech therapy, it really needs to be put up there as one of the options that you consider as a possible therapy for your child. Because of the intensity of the hours, it's not a practical solution for everyone. It might work for many people, but it's not a practical solution for every family. It involved me giving up my job for 3 years to supervise and be part of his ABA therapy because his separation anxiety was so bad that if I wasn't there or if a parent wasn't there, there's no way he could have engaged with the therapists. That's not going to be everyone's experience. There will be some children on the autism spectrum who don't have that separation anxiety and so could get a grandparent or a babysitter to, stand in. But as for its effectiveness, if you do your research, you'll see there's a lot of clinical literature out there that says this is one of the most effective therapies done in that early age to get a child school ready. I hope my story helps spread that message amongst other parents who find themselves in a similar situation because it wasn't readily available information for me. I really had to dig around before I'd even heard about the term ABA therapy. We were hearing about OT, we were hearing about psychology, we were hearing about speech therapy, but it was months down the line before we heard about ABA therapy.
This journey must have impacted your own mental health as well as those of your partner and your family, and particularly of your daughter Tessa, as you've just mentioned. How did you manage that, and what steps did you take?
So a lot of this book unfolds during the pandemic in Melbourne, which was under really strict lockdown orders. I think we spent 245 days under lockdown over 2 years. So it meant that a lot of the usual supports for mental health were not open to us. No one was seeing clients face to face. It had to be a real emergency for that. And including Harry himself couldn't really go see a paediatrician face to face or see a clinician face to face. So this was not the ordinary situation where you might just book in to see a psychologist and talk about, how you're feeling with the burden of parenting a neurodiverse child. I was limited to telehealth, but also we were all locked down. So my son was in the room and he would be trying to control all of my Zoom meetings and hang up my phone calls. It really wasn't a practical solution to just ring up and have an appointment and chat to a psychologist on the phone. So I just tried to internally deal with it, which is not the ideal way to deal with it. And it kind of ate me alive from the inside. The book, it chronicles this descent into chaos where there's one layer of difficulty after another. There's me returning to work. There's my son receiving his autism diagnosis. There's the lockdown. There's the fact that we can't get any help for him because of the lockdown. There's all of us trapped in a house with him, and we're worried about how to keep our daughter safe from him during a meltdown. So all these things are adding on top of each other, and I'm sleeping badly, and my husband and I stopped talking to each other because all we're doing, we're slaves to our children. We're just trying to keep them safe from one another. And really, I wasn't able to talk about it in front of a professional until 2 years after this first unfolded. And it has been helpful, even with that time elapsed, to then go see a counsellor and speak to them about it. But in the moment, I just had to do what many parents of autistic children do, which is survive and deal with it internally and, somewhat self-destructively. I remember having, extremely disturbing and intrusive thoughts about myself and about my son, and not being able to speak to anyone about it, including my husband. So I'd just go to bed at night and throw the covers over my head and just indulge in these thoughts for nights on end. And my mental health deteriorated, and it's taken years from that point to recover and feel well enough to write this story and return back to work and feel positive about things again. But at the time, there was really not that many options available to me.
In the epilogue to this book, you write to Harry directly. It's a very tender address, appreciative of the experience you've had in some ways, and that leads me to this, the final question. Who is the Harry you have on your hands now, and what hopes do you have for his future?
So Harry is now 6, almost 7, and he's this incredibly creative, funny, and imaginative little boy. He went to school last year. He started prep last year, and that was something which at the start of the book seemed really unlikely. We were doing all this therapy with the goal of getting him school ready, but we didn't really believe it was going to happen. So when he finally went off to school last year, and you know, he he had all the skills he needed to have a successful first year of school, and he had a really great time there, loved his teacher, made friends. And I found that when I went to pick him up from school at the end of the day, he was not in a hurry to leave. He just wanted to hang out and keep playing there. So I have a child who at school is just like a regular little boy. At home, we still have some challenges, and I expect that we will always have a set of challenges that we are, trying to overcome or help him build skills with, and that's part of the journey of autism. Um, but for him to be able to participate in the experience that most children get to have at his age and enjoy it, that's probably key. He's enjoying his life as a school child right now. That has been the greatest achievement of my life. And I hope that in years to come, and I'm sure there will be times in his life where he has other challenges, maybe when he changes school or goes through puberty or has his first relationship breakup. I hope that one day he gets to read this book and see what he overcame as a young child and know that he has already overcome a bigger hurdle than most people ever will. It's my hope that he'll read this story and know how much we poured into, giving him the best chance of life. There's so much love and dedication there, not only just from his family, but from the therapists that have worked with him tirelessly over this course of 3 years, and his teachers who sort of really got to know him and his special interests and learned from the therapists how to best support and accommodate him in a school setting, and basically gave him the chance to be like every other kid out there his age.
Porscia Lam, thanks so much for sharing your story, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much, Greg. Thanks for having me.
I've been talking to Porscia Lam about her first book, The Unlocking, an Autism Story. It's published by The Kind Press, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. This Good Reading podcast was brought to you by Book People gift cards. Share the joy of reading with a Book People gift card. To find out more, visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.